"Do you even know where you are, old man?" The voice, sharp and laced with the condescending arrogance of youth, cut through the low hum of the control tower. Airman First Class Davies, barely 20, stood with his arms crossed, a perfect picture of military crispness and impatience. His superior, Staff Sergeant Miller, stood beside him, a clipboard in hand and a look of profound annoyance on his face. The target of their irritation, Frank Peterson, said nothing. At 87, he seemed as ancient and immovable as the distant mountains visible through the panoramic glass. Dressed in a simple windbreaker and slacks, he looked utterly out of place amidst the glowing screens, complex consoles, and uniformed personnel of the state-of-the-art facility. He simply kept his gaze fixed on the airfield below, where a squadron of F-35s shimmered in the afternoon sun. His hands rested on the window ledge, the skin thin as parchment over a lattice of bone and vein. He was perfectly still, his silence a stark contrast to the coiled energy of the young airman. Miller sighed, a theatrical display of a man whose time was being wasted. "Sir, for the third time, this is a restricted area. I need to see your authorization, or I'm calling security forces. You can't just wander in here." Frank's gaze finally shifted, not to the angry men beside him, but to a jet taxiing onto the runway. His eyes, though clouded by age, held a clarity that was unsettling. They weren't vacant, they were processing, remembering. "They're so quiet now," he murmured, his voice a dry rasp. "You can barely hear the engines whine until they're right on top of you." Davies scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Look, we don't have time for a trip down memory lane. ID, now." Frank slowly reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. It was old, the corners softened, and the leather cracked like dry earth. He fumbled with it for a moment, his fingers not as nimble as they once were. The delay only deepened the scowl on Davies's face. Other airmen in the tower, controllers in the middle of their shifts, were starting to notice the quiet drama. They exchanged glances, some with smirks, others with a flicker of discomfort. The tower was a place of supreme confidence and control. The old man's presence was a glitch in the system, a loose wire sparking uncertainty. "He's probably just confused," one airman whispered to another over his console. "Probably thinks this is the visitor's center." Staff Sergeant Miller's patience finally snapped. "That's it. I'm not playing games." He tapped his radio. "Tower to command post, I need a security forces patrol to my location. We have an unauthorized civilian, non-compliant." Frank finally produced a simple, state-issued driver's license from his wallet and held it out. Miller snatched it from his hand. "Frank Peterson. Address is a retirement community downtown. Figures." He handed it to Davies. "Run this. See if he's got any priors for trespassing on federal property." "Sir, I was invited," Frank said, his voice calm and even. "A reunion." Davies laughed out loud this time. "A reunion? In here? What, did you and your buddies used to play bingo around the radar screens?" The younger airman snickered. The humiliation was a palpable thing now, hanging in the climate-controlled air. But Frank didn't flinch. His gaze drifted back to the runway, to the fighter jet now thundering down the concrete, lifting into the sky with a roar that vibrated through the glass. He watched it until it was just a speck. It was as if the drama around him was nothing more than background noise, a minor distraction from the real show. "You don't understand," Frank said, more to the disappearing jet than to anyone in the room. "This room, it's the same view, just a different sky." Miller stepped closer, his posture intimidating. He lowered his voice, a feigned attempt at reasonableness that was more menacing than his shouting. "Mr. Peterson, I don't know what you think this is. This is the nerve center of an active Air Force base. The most advanced aircraft in the world are guided from these seats. What you see out there is billions of dollars of technology and hundreds of lives that depend on us doing our jobs without interruptions." He gestured vaguely at Frank, as if he were a piece of litter that needed to be swept away. The other controllers focused back on their work, but the tension remained. They were all acutely aware of the old man by the window and the two airmen closing in on him. The air crackled with unspoken judgment. Frank was an anomaly, an old man in a young person's world, a relic in a room dedicated to the future. His quiet dignity was misinterpreted as senile stubbornness, his nostalgic gaze as the confused wandering of a lost mind. As Frank returned his wallet to his pocket, a small object on the lapel of his windbreaker caught Davies's eye. It was a pin, no bigger than a dime, made of a dull, tarnished metal. It was unadorned, with no discernible military insignia or polished gleam. It looked like something a child might find in the dirt. "What's that thing?" Davies asked, pointing. "Some kind of club pin. Did you win a prize at the Senior Center Bake-Off?" Frank's hand instinctively went to the pin, his thumb stroking its worn surface. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. It wasn't anger or hurt. It was something deeper, a shadow passing over a vast, still lake. The sterile hum of the tower faded, replaced for a heartbeat by a different sound. A scream, not of a person but of metal tearing apart at 30,000 feet. He felt a phantom chill, the deep, biting cold of a high-altitude night. In his mind's eye, he saw not the sunny airfield but a blanket of absolute blackness, pricked by the distant, indifferent light of stars. He felt the weight of a hand on his shoulder, a hand that was shaking, and heard a voice crackling with static and terror through a headset he hadn't worn in 60 years. "We're blind, Frank. We're blind up here. Just get us home." The memory vanished as quickly as it came, leaving Frank standing by the window, his thumb still on the pin. The present rushed back in, with Davy's sneering face and Miller's impending call to security forces. The confrontation was reaching its peak. Miller, seeing the security forces' vehicle pulling up at the base of the tower, felt a surge of righteous authority. He was handling the situation by the book. He was in control. "All right, Mr. Peterson," Miller said, his voice hard. "Your little visit is officially over. These men will escort you off the base." But not everyone was convinced. In a slightly darker corner of the tower at the supervisory console, Captain Eva Rostova had been observing the entire exchange. A career officer with a decade of service, she had an instinct for things that didn't add up. Initially, she shared Miller's annoyance at the breach of protocol, but as she watched the old man, something held her back. It wasn't just his preternatural calm, it was his eyes. She'd seen eyes like that before, in the faces of combat veterans who had returned from deployments. Eyes that had seen too much to be rattled by a puffed-up staff sergeant. Then she saw the pin. It was small, indistinct, but something about its simple, functional design tugged at a memory from a history seminar she'd taken at the academy. It was from a program that was barely a footnote in the official records, a declassified ghost story. Miller was now gesturing for the arriving security forces to come up. Rostova knew she had only seconds. Acting on a pure gut feeling, she stood up and walked into the small adjoining office, pulling the door almost shut. She ignored the number for security forces. Her finger hovered over the keypad on her desk phone. Then she dialed the base's command section. She was bypassing her entire chain of command, a potentially career-ending move. "This is Captain Rostova in the control tower," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Patch me through to the wing commander's office. It's a Protocol 7 matter." Protocol 7 was a rarely used designation, reserved for situations involving distinguished visitors or potential diplomatic incidents. It was a code that guaranteed a response. Within seconds, an aide was on the line. "There's an elderly civilian in the tower," Rostova explained quickly. "Staff Sergeant Miller is having him removed. The man's name is Frank Peterson." She paused, taking a breath. "He's wearing a pin. It's a small, unmarked piece of metal. I think it might be from Project Nightfall." She said the name, and then held her breath. For a moment, there was only silence on the other end of the line. The audience of airmen in the tower could see the security patrol entering the elevator. They knew the old man was about to be forcibly removed. But the viewer, listening in on this phone call, now knew something they did not. A different kind of response had just been triggered. Help was on the way, but it wasn't for Staff Sergeant Miller. The cutaway is abrupt. We are no longer in the glass-walled tower, but in a richly furnished office, the walls adorned with commendations and photographs of aircraft. Wing Commander Colonel Marcus Thorne, a man whose face was a permanent mask of stern authority, was holding a phone to his ear, his knuckles white. "Say that again, Captain," he ordered, his voice dangerously low. Captain Rostova's voice came through the speaker, tinny but clear. "His name is Frank Peterson, sir, and he is wearing what I believe is a Nightfall service pin." Colonel Thorne's expression went from stern to stunned, the color drained from his face. He sat bolt upright in his leather chair, his mind racing through classified historical annexes he had been required to memorize. Project Nightfall. Frank Peterson. It wasn't possible. The men from that program were all gone, their names redacted from history, their deeds sealed in vaults. "Keep him there, Captain," Thorne commanded, his voice now tight with a new and unfamiliar emotion, panic. "Do not let your men touch him. I don't care what you have to do. Stall them. I am on my way." He slammed the phone down and bellowed for his aide, a young lieutenant who scrambled into the office. "Get me General Wallace on the line. Use the red phone. Tell his office it's a Broken Arrow priority. No, tell them it's about Frank Peterson." He was already shrugging on his pristine service dress jacket, his movements jerky and frantic. The aide, who had never seen the colonel so rattled, stared in confusion. "Go, now," Thorne barked. The aide fled. The name Frank Peterson meant nothing to him, but the wing commander's terror was infectious. A storm was coming. Back in the control tower, ignorance was bliss. The two security forces airmen, armed and imposing, stepped out of the elevator. Staff Sergeant Miller pointed a thumb at Frank. "That's him. He's been non-compliant since he arrived. I want him escorted to the gate," and issued a formal trespass warning. Airman Davies smirked, enjoying the finality of the moment. He stepped toward Frank, who was still looking out the window, seemingly lost to the world. "Time to go, Grandpa," Davies said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your little field trip is over. Let's not make this difficult." One of the security airmen placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. It was meant to be a firm guiding touch, but in the context of the public humiliation, it was an act of final dominance. This was the point of no return. They were treating a legend like a vagrant. Frank finally turned his head, his calm eyes meeting the young airman's. He didn't look scared. He looked disappointed. Just as the airman began to apply pressure, the elevator doors hissed open again with a violence that made everyone jump. Out strode Colonel Thorne, his face a thundercloud, his eyes blazing. He was followed by the base command chief and a handful of other high-ranking officers. Their arrival was so sudden and so shocking that the background chatter of the tower died instantly. Miller and Davies snapped to attention, their mouths agape. But it was the man who followed them out of the elevator that sucked all the air out of the room. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark blue service uniform adorned with 4 silver stars on each shoulder. A constellation of ribbons and medals covered his chest. This was General Marcus Wallace, commander of Air Combat Command, one of the most powerful men in the entire United States military. A 4-star general's presence in a base control tower was so unheard of it was practically reality-bending. He was a figure you saw on television or in grainy photos from the Pentagon, not 10 feet away from your workstation. The very air seemed to grow heavy and still. The general's eyes, sharp and predatory, swept the room in a single dismissive glance. He ignored the saluting colonel, the terrified NCOs, and the armed security men. His gaze landed on one person and one person only, the frail old man in the windbreaker. Without a word, General Wallace strode across the floor, his polished shoes making no sound. The entire room held its breath. He walked past Miller and Davies as if they were furniture. He stopped directly in front of Frank Peterson. For a long moment, the two men just looked at each other, the 4-star general and the forgotten civilian. Then, in an act that defied all logic and protocol for the stunned onlookers, General Wallace brought his heels together with an audible click. He raised his right hand to his brow in a salute so sharp, so precise it could have cut glass. He held it, his arm rigid, his gaze locked on Frank's. The silence stretched into an eternity. Davies looked like he might faint. Miller's face had turned a sickly shade of pale green. Finally, the general spoke, his voice a low baritone that filled the silent room with an unshakable authority. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice thick with a profound and genuine reverence. "It is an honor, sir." He held the salute for another beat before slowly lowering his hand. He then turned his head slightly, addressing the petrified airmen in the room, but his words were clearly a tribute meant for Frank. "For those of you who don't know," the general's voice boomed, gaining strength, "you are in the presence of a ghost, a man whose name was classified for 50 years. You are standing in front of Frank Peterson, the lead mission controller for Project Nightfall during the height of the Cold War." He gestured out the window, toward the vast expanse of the sky. From a concrete bunker buried 1,000 feet underground with none of the technology you take for granted today, this man was the eyes and ears for the most daring reconnaissance missions in our nation's history. He and his team guided pilots through enemy territory when they were alone, hunted and completely dark. The general's eyes found the small tarnished pin on Frank's lapel. "You see this pin?" he asked, his voice dropping again, becoming more personal. In 1968, an SR-71 spy plane suffered a catastrophic systems failure over hostile airspace. Navigation, communications, everything went dead. They were flying blind at 80,000 feet, a dead plane waiting to be shot down. But they weren't alone. The general turned back to Frank. This man, using nothing more than a slide rule, a stopwatch, and his encyclopedic knowledge of the star charts, talked that pilot and his reconnaissance officer home. For 3 hours he was their compass. He was their radio. He was their guardian angel. He did it all from memory, plotting a course that brought them across 3 borders and landed them on a friendly airstrip with their fuel tanks on empty. The pilot gave him this pin, his own squadron pin, because Frank had earned it more than anyone. The room was a cathedral of stunned silence. The airman, who minutes before had seen a confused old man, now saw a giant. Davies's sneer had been replaced by a slack-jawed look of utter disbelief. Captain Rostova felt a tear trace a path down her cheek. She hadn't been wrong. She had been in the presence of greatness and had almost failed to recognize it. Frank simply inclined his head, a quiet acknowledgement of a memory that was his alone. General Wallace's warm, respectful expression vanished as he turned his gaze upon Miller and Davies. The temperature in the room plummeted. His voice was no longer booming. It was a blade of ice. "You," he said, his eyes locking onto Staff Sergeant Miller. "You stand in a room built on the legacy of men like him. You operate equipment that exists because of the risks they took. You saw a living piece of that history, and you treated him like a trespasser." He then shifted his laser-like focus to Davies. "And you saw a hero, and you mocked him. Your lack of situational awareness is an embarrassment. Your lack of respect is a disgrace to that uniform." He didn't need to raise his voice. The quiet fury was more terrifying than any shouting could ever be. "Colonel Thorne," the general said without looking away from the two stricken airmen, "I want these two in my office at 0800 tomorrow. Their careers in my Air Force are over. They can find a new line of work that doesn't require judgment or honor." As the two men seemed to physically shrink under the weight of the general's words, Frank Peterson took a small step forward. He placed a frail hand on the general's perfectly starched sleeve. "General," Frank said, his voice soft but clear, "they're young. They are trained to see the world in black and white, friend or foe, authorized or unauthorized. It's a different Air Force now, safer in some ways, more rigid in others. Don't ruin their lives over an old man's sentimentality." His grace was more stunning than the general's rebuke. He was defending the very men who had just finished humiliating him. "The most important thing," Frank continued, his eyes moving to meet Davies's, "isn't the rank on your sleeve but the history you carry with you. Respect the mission, son. But respect the man who came before you even more." As Frank spoke of the man who came before, the scene shimmered for a moment. The modern tower dissolved into a dark, cramped room from decades past, lit only by the green glow of primitive radar screens. A younger Frank Peterson, his face etched with exhaustion and immense strain, leaned over a console speaking calmly into a headset. On the other end, a voice was screaming about instrument failure, about being lost in a sea of darkness. Hours later, in a debriefing room, a pale and shaken pilot, a young man not much older than Davies, gripped Frank's hand. He unpinned the small metal insignia from his own flight suit and pressed it into Frank's palm. "You were our eyes when we were blind," the pilot had whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You brought us home." The fallout from that afternoon was swift and decisive. While Frank's plea saved Miller and Davies from being discharged, their careers were irrevocably altered. They were reassigned to the most remote, undesirable posts available, tasked with duties that involved minimal human interaction. More importantly, General Wallace was true to his word. He instituted a new base-wide heritage program. The first mandatory lesson for every new airman arriving at the base was now the story of Frank Peterson and Project Nightfall. A plaque was installed at the entrance to the control tower, bearing his name and a brief declassified account of his service. The tower had become a monument. A few weeks later, Frank was sitting in his usual booth at a small diner near his retirement home, looking out the window at the passing traffic. The bell above the door chimed, and a young man in civilian clothes walked in, looking around nervously. It was the former Airman First Class, Davies. He spotted Frank and approached the table, his posture hesitant, his former arrogance completely gone, replaced by a deep, humbling shame. "Mr. Peterson," he asked quietly. Frank looked up and offered a small smile. "Son, sit down." Davies slid into the booth. "Sir, I don't know what to say. Sorry isn't enough. The way I treated you, there's no excuse." Frank just nodded, taking a slow sip of his coffee. He didn't lecture. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply asked, "Why did you join the Air Force, son?" The question caught Davies off guard. He stammered for a moment, then spoke about wanting to work with technology, to serve his country. Frank listened patiently. When Davies was finished, Frank looked out the window again, that same far-off gaze he'd had in the tower. "It's a good job," Frank said softly. "Just remember, the machines change, the mission changes, but the person sitting next to you, and the ghosts of the people who sat in that chair before you, that's the part that never changes. That's the part you have to honor." It was a quiet moment of forgiveness, a final lesson from an old teacher to a young student. The circle was complete. The past had reached out and taught the present a vital lesson in humility and respect. The quiet heroes who walk among us carry stories we can all learn from. If you were inspired by Frank Peterson's story of dignity and grace, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories of unassuming heroes.